This is our first West Coast Holocaust education engagement. In this series so far, we interviewed the Holocaust education leaders from Milwaukee, from Chicago, from New York City. And today, we're going to be speaking to Ilana Cohn-Kennedy. Ilana Cohn-Kennedy has joined the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle in Washington State in 2003. And she is the director of education of the center. Ilana, it's my pleasure to have you in our program. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Shai. Thank you. I really appreciate being here.
Thank you. This is great. So, Ilana, like I asked your colleagues who have been here before, I firmly believe that everyone who comes to the field of Holocaust education, no matter whether they're Jewish or not Jewish. By the way, this is another question that folks asked me offline, whether Yeshiva University is offering courses on the Holocaust only for Jews. And the answer is, of course, not at all. In order to do the certificate, you have to be a teacher, or the master's, you have to be a graduate student, want to be a graduate student. But what you need basically are two conditions. You need intellectual curiosity and a living pulse. So I want to mention that. We all have different journeys, and I'm curious to know what your journey is and how it led you to Holocaust education.
Well, I don't think I ever anticipated making a career of Holocaust education. I did a master's degree in comparative religion and Jewish studies and did a master's thesis on the Holocaust. And I was especially interested in the topic then. I wouldn't say I was not a student in high school who was endlessly fascinated with the topic. I grew up Jewish, but this was not really a particular interest of mine. But once I got to graduate school, I was increasingly fascinated with the complexity of it and the complexity of human beings.
What triggered it? Was there something that triggered it in particular? All of a sudden?
No, I really took a great class in my master's program on Holocaust literature. And I just kept unpeeling the onion is what I felt like. And I just felt like I couldn't get enough of it, even when the class was far over. So I went on to do some postgraduate work and came back to Seattle. And I was working for another organization when a position opened up at the Holocaust Center, which at that time was like 3.5 people. And, you know, this was 2003. It was just a tiny organization. And I thought, okay, I'll give that a try. I'm interested in the topic. I know a little bit about it. And, you know, 17 years later, here I am.
Okay. The center, by the way, has an interesting name, Holocaust Center for Humanity. I'm curious about the provenance of the name, and if you can also link it to the mission of the center, the constituents that it serves. I want to know more.
That's a great question. So when I started back in 2003, it was called, get ready, the Washington State Holocaust Education Resource Center.
Quite a mouthful. Okay.
It is a mouthful. So in 2014 or 2015, we rebranded basically with a name that was one a little shorter, but that also gave the context of trying to understand that this topic is a huge topic that resonates with all of us, that it's about humanity and about individuals everywhere. So this name really spoke to our mission.
Mm-hmm. How many people does the center reach per year?
Yeah, so we reach about 40,000 students each year, and we have a small museum. So we have normally pre-COVID times, we have field trips coming all the time from schools all around the area to come to our exhibits. We have a speakers bureau that goes out, now it's virtual, of course, to speak to classes and students and community groups, and we do lots of educational outreach. So we moved into this new space with the museum in 2015, but prior to that, all we did was educational outreach because we didn't have a physical location for people to come. So a lot of our mission is focused on supporting teachers, supporting educators, and doing community programming.
Now, Holocaust education is a very dynamic field. I know that no day is like the previous one, but describe to me a little bit your routine, interaction with teachers. What does that look like for you?
It's really varied over the years. And of course, now that I'm working at home, everything's a little bit different as all the teachers are also working at home. But typically it would be looking for opportunities to provide professional development for teachers. So we offer a lot of teacher trainings. It might even mean going to a school and meeting with the teacher there. Sometimes we do presentations to classes themselves. It's a little bit of everything. Part of my job, I feel like, is that I just have my hands in all areas. So I also work on our website and work with our student leadership board and a teacher advisory board. It's a little of everything. And I also have a really incredible team of 3 people who I work with who are really into the nitty-gritty of everything.
Does Seattle have a Holocaust survivor community?
Yes, we do. And originally, our Speakers Bureau was all Holocaust survivors. Over the years, of course, like everywhere, that has really changed as either they're no longer living or they're just becoming too elderly to speak to students. So we've really focused on working with the children and grandchildren of survivors, and we call it our Legacy Speakers program. So we now have, our Speakers Bureau consists of a handful of survivors and children and grandchildren who have learned their parents' stories and are prepared with a presentation for schools.
That's impressive, including grandchildren.
Yeah.
Oh, that's impressive. So everyday objects. You wanted to talk to me today about everyday objects that you bring to the classroom using artifacts to teach about the Holocaust. What are the objects that you prepared for us? You showed me before offline, but show us now when we go live what you got.
So I'll just, if it's okay, I'll just back up a little bit and tell you that one of the reasons I love artifacts so much is because I love things that are tangible. And I think because I was a middle school, high school student who was really not that interested in history, I'm always thinking in my head, how do I appeal to my 14-year-old self and make history interesting? And I think I'm not alone when I look at a lot of 13, 14, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, that history sometimes can be pretty dry. But if you can give a student something to hold on to and something to look at and explore, sometimes it really comes to life in a much more multidimensional way than just reading a book or reading an article. So one of the things with all our teaching materials that we put together was a collection of replica artifacts that each represent an artifact that we have in our museum. So each artifact is representative of a local story from a Holocaust survivor in the Seattle or Washington state area. And it's something that we actually have in our collection. Again, these are all replicas, but I'll show you. So here's a little box.
While you get ready to show them, I want to ask you about this box in a moment. I would like to remind our viewers who are joining us online. So far, we have reached over 6,500 viewers. Most of them join us to watch the recorded session. But those of us who are joining us right now are welcome in the comment section of the Facebook Live cast. Are welcome to send you their questions. And we will get to a short Q&A as we always do towards the end. So I saw a box, a plastic container. What's that about?
Well, okay, Shai, I can talk forever about artifacts. So if I start going on too long, I'm going to trust that you will just tell me like we must move on. Okay. So
yes, I'm looking at yeah, that's my job.
Okay, so in this box that we loan out to teachers, it comes with teaching materials, but it consists of objects that, as I mentioned, are replica artifacts. So for example, one is a yellow star. There's a couple photographs. Here's one, and I might, if there's time,
you are
I might talk more about
you are touching a yellow star, just so our viewers understand. You don't touch it in the most sensitive way because it's not a real yellow star. It's a replica of a real one that you have at the museum, right?
That's correct. Yes, because we wouldn't actually bring the real artifacts out and let everybody touch them. But when it's like this, then we could pass it around to students, or if it's a teacher workshop, pass it around to the teachers, let them look at it, or let them feel it. The pictures, it's hard to tell here, but they're all made of like photographic material, so it feels like a picture. Mm-hmm. There's a German passport, looks like this one, and if you open it up, it's got the red J that was used to identify Jews in Germany.
So this is a replica? I mean, it looks so real. Okay.
They all look very real. We worked with a great printer to make the passports. And then it has it has all the pages in it with the photo of the survivor who we received it from. Mm-hmm. So we took really great care in making these so that they would look like the real objects, and they would give you a sense of the person or even of the time. So, and here's one other one. It's a child's shoe. So,
and this is a replica of a shoe.
Yes. So actually, this one, I feel kind of bad doing this. I'm going to like pull back the curtains a little bit here. But so the shoe, this one is actually a shoe of the period, but we bought it on eBay. So this is actually just a child's shoe from the 1940s, but we have one just like it on loan to us from the Auschwitz Museum in our collection. So this is representative of that particular shoe. So we would have, if we were to be doing an activity with students, we would put them into groups and we would have the students explore these different artifacts. And without knowing necessarily anything about them, we might ask them, write down a couple of sentences about what you noticed about this shoe. Mm-hmm. And then write down a little bit about who you think might have worn it. Mm-hmm. And then we give them some information about the shoe or about the artifact, like about the passport and about the survivor. Mm-hmm. And we ask them, what are a couple...
It's interesting, I would have a similar activity with the students that I worked with, asking them to look at their shoes and to tell a story that relates to their shoes, who gave it to them, who bought it for them, why they wear it. With the idea is a transition from an inanimate object to the living person. Is that the purpose of, you would say, of bringing the artifacts, that they symbolize a living person?
Definitely, and it's to humanize the story, that from the small story of the photograph, here's another one. From the small story of a photograph, you can then zoom out to the larger story of Holocaust history. So instead of starting with this huge Holocaust history, you just focus on this little girl to the left of the teacher and what is her story, or what do you notice about this picture? And you can't necessarily see that, but all the kids are wearing Jewish stars on their uniforms. So this is a Jewish
I can see
school.
that. Yeah, I can see that, but I'm curious to learn more about the photo. So,
right.
Where is this photo from?
So this photo is from Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, and it belongs to a woman named Frida. She's actually this little girl right here that I'm pointing at. And she was a Mischling, so she was half Jewish. Her mother was not Jewish, but her father was. And so she had this very unique status once the Nazis took power in Czechoslovakia. So she was forced to attend this Jewish school, but when all of the children were deported to Theresienstadt, she was not deported until she was 14, which was the rule for Mischlings. And because she had this mixed status, she stayed in Theresienstadt for the duration of the war. She was not deported to other camps as so many of the children were. So this is how she survived. So after the war, she has this class photo, and some of the students, their families, not the students, but their families returned to the town where she was in. And of course, photos were not as plentiful in those days as they are today, or easy to reproduce. And she cut out the pictures of her classmates to give to the surviving family members because they didn't have photos of their children. So that is why this photo, it's kind of hard to see, has the cutouts. So it's these personal stories. It's like from there, then you can start looking at, well, what was going on in Czechoslovakia? What about this classification system? How do we identify who's Jewish and who isn't? And you can start posing all kinds of questions and looking at her individual story.
In other words, this was my reaction when I first heard about the subject that you wanted to introduce. I had a little bit of a fear that perhaps students would be too much focused. They would too much gravitate towards the objects. And while they would be focusing on the trees, they would not see the forest at all. In other words, they'll learn about a yellow badge and a shoe and get attracted to it, but may come out of the classroom without necessarily the knowledge of the chronology and the history. So it seems like you are very cognizant of the need to balance that.
Yes, definitely. This is more of an introductory point and a way to just humanize this large history, but not in place of the large history. It can't be separated out. It all has to work together to make sense.
Okay, and these containers that you showed me, are they on loan? Are they being lent to schools? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So these little boxes of artifacts, they come in our Holocaust teaching trunks, and our trunks are free for teachers to borrow. They contain books and lesson plans. In the old days, they used to contain like DVDs and VHS. Now it's all online, but it comes in there. So teachers can request these from our Holocaust Center, the whole trunk, and the artifacts are in the trunk. So just as you said, they're part of this bigger context to see how does this all fit together and humanize the story. And one thing I didn't mention, we deliberately set up the artifacts so that each of the stories presents a different aspect or a different experience of the Holocaust. So some of the artifacts are stories of people who were rescued. One, the shoe, of course, is the story of a child in a camp. So they're all different to show that there's no one single narrative that explains the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other artifacts you wanted to show?
Well, let's see. I showed the passport, and there's this other one. Okay, this one I'm just going to show because it's so interesting, and it was one of those things I really didn't know about until I started working at the Holocaust Center. These are very tiny, so I'm going to try and hold them up and show you. But these are cigarette cards, and we have hundreds of these actually in our collection. And they're little propaganda images, basically, that came in cigarette boxes in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. They were like collector's cards. And they come in different series. So this one is like Nazi power. So it shows like the burning of the Reichstag, and it shows like a huge crowd of people giving the Heil Hitler salute, and another one of Hitler. So you could basically collect these in series, and then this was all through the cigarette company. You could order away for your collector's book, and you could paste them into your book in the proper order.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the container, this is like a mini trunk of artifacts that is placed within a larger trunk filled with books, right? With books and DVDs. So
yes.
These trunks travel. So in a way, what you create is a museological experience outside the museum.
Yes.
Would that be a correct representation?
That is a great way to see it. It's like a way of providing an experience and something tangible to students in the classroom. And actually these replica artifacts, we have them in our museum also, so that while you're looking at objects, there's also something that you can hold or touch or see as well.
Okay, this is something I sensed. We've interviewed directors of education at museums, but also at at outreach centers. So your center in Washington in a way is both an outreach center and a museum. So I suppose that the instruction going over the artifacts, explaining what they are, doesn't really is not really done by you or your docents, but rather by the teacher, right? The teacher who receives the trunk.
If it's correct, if it's in the classroom, then the teacher would do it. There's also in the trunk explanatory sheets that describe each of the artifacts, because we don't expect the teachers to actually know all of this just offhand or to know these stories. So they could actually just pass them out to the students, let the students read about each artifact and make notes, or there's an activity that actually runs them through thinking about who are all the people and characters involved in this particular story. Are there bystanders, perpetrators, collaborators? Who are all the individuals in this bigger story? Let's say even a Frida going to Theresienstadt in the school. And to ask them to think about the bigger context of outside just that little picture that you're looking at.
So you provide them with a resource. You are not the trying to substitute the teacher, be the teacher in the class and provide the whole curriculum, but rather to provide the teachers with curricular support, right, and with resources.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm curious what the teachers report. What's their experience when they report to you? If you evaluate, if you assess their experiences.
From all the materials in the trunk, we always hear from the teachers that the artifacts are their favorites, and they just wish that there were more. That it's engaging for the students, it's a point of entry that they can start exploring, and it just humanizes the topic. So it's very, very positive feedback, especially on the artifacts.
What do you mean when you say humanize the topic?
Well, I think it's easy with the Holocaust to think in terms of numbers, or to, especially in terms of numbers. And it's easy to get overwhelmed with the numbers. If we're talking 6 million Jews, millions of non-Jewish victims, how do you think about that? And a very complicated history, I want to add that in too. So when you think of all that, how do you boil it down to an individual person? What did they experience? What were their fears? What were their joys through all of this? How did they make choices? And all of those things are things that as human beings, we can really relate to. And I guess I feel like there are lots of things in history where I can look up the numbers and the statistics and the history, and I'll never remember them for the life of me, which is good. I can look them up. But I will remember the personal stories, and I'll remember how I felt when I read about that person. And that will stick with me, and that will influence me as I go forth in making my own decisions.
Perfect answer. And this is very powerful. I wanted to explain, I think educators would know exactly what you mean when you talk about the need to humanize the story and the challenge we have when we normally teach the Holocaust through statistics. It was important for me that everyone would know that. So this was my question.
Sure.
Now I have a question from the audience. Maybe before the question of the audience, I will remind you all that Holocaust Education in Times of Uncertainty is a production of the Emil and Jenny Fish Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center at Yeshiva University. I'm Shai Pilnik. I'm the proud founding director of the center. The series is also a partnership with your center, Ilana, with the Center for, with the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle, but also with the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City, with the Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee, with the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Skokie, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, and with the Florida Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg. So a question for you that Helena Goodman, who is helping us with a tech support, just texted me. During the COVID-19 pandemic, how are you addressing the lending of trunks for this upcoming school year? Good question. So far we talked about the pre-COVID era. I hope also the post-COVID era. God willing, bimera b'yamenu soon. But during the pandemic era, what's the deal with the trunks is the question.
Helena, that is such a good question and is the topic of just about every meeting that we have as a staff. We are still trying to figure it out, and we're kind of waiting to hear, will schools be in session? Will, if they are in session, will we be able to send the trunks out? We are just basically waiting to see. What we do plan to do is to have, the images of the artifacts online. We can always make pictures available. We can help teachers through, online professional development, but we just don't have any way, if the schools aren't open, to get the objects into the hands of the students. Of course, we can load the trunk with a bunch of sanitizing wipes and hope for the best, but that'll be up for the teacher.
Okay, let me see. So far, no more questions, but let me ask you the question I like to ask all of our interviewees, because this is a very personal interview about your journey. Would you share with us, we're going now between two diametric opposites. the most uplifting, inspiring, incredible experience you had as the Director of Education at the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle, Washington, and the most challenging, difficult, perhaps frustrating experience. You already mentioned to me before that you have more than one frustrating, but pick your best or go for it. Share all of us with
I
it.
know. I'm going to try and narrow it down to like one. So I would say, I think this is more challenging maybe than frustrating. And I'll start with this one. But it's this idea that we see the Nazis and we see Nazi Germany sometimes as so other than ourselves and as something that is completely foreign to us personally. And I feel like it's so important in a way to understand that so many of the Nazis were really very regular human beings. And that's important because we need to understand for all of us as individuals, we're all on a slippery slope of what we're capable of, both good and bad. And if we don't recognize that, then we don't even recognize when we might be going off the cliff. So I think one of the most influential books that I read very early on, it's called Becoming Evil by Dr. James Waller. And it's really about that progression of how very ordinary people can start to take a turn, whether wittingly or not. And there's a great article also that I'll just mention by Facing History and Ourselves called No Time to Think. And again, it's not even a Nazi. It's really this article and this testimony from a person who just said, I just made decisions along the way and these just seemed like the easier decisions to make, or I wanted to advance my career, and how all of those things contribute to what in the end became a mass atrocity. So I would just say this is a real challenge, is reminding teachers and others that it's really important to recognize that the humanness of the Nazis.
In other words, there are people who come to you with an impression that Nazism is about people who are evil, and psychiatrically they are pathologically sick, and their activities, their evil activities, stand beyond the so-called normal human experience. And you're basically
perfectly said.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that one of the most puzzling facts of the Holocaust are that the majority of the perpetrators were not clinically sick, from a psychiatric standpoint. So this is a challenge you encounter with people who just refuse to accept it or to understand it.
Yes, I would say it's a challenge.
I can totally relate.
Yeah, a challenge. And I would say I challenge myself to think, at what point in my own life am I actually being like that unwittingly? Like, where are my blind spots that I don't recognize, that maybe I'm doing things like that? And I have to constantly, also check in with myself on that. So it's a challenge both with others and with myself. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I suppose that opening their eyes to understanding that that's not the case, that's one of the most uplifting experience should be, right?
Yes, I would say that's the flip side is like, I would say the really inspirational part when I start to get really frustrated is when I look at our student leadership board and these amazing young teens who are volunteering their time to work with our Holocaust Center on a regular basis, who come up with all these ideas. They're not doing it for grades. They're simply doing it because they believe that this is an important subject and that it's making a difference. And I look at their optimism and their dedication, and I am just completely inspired by the work that they do and their willingness to be a part of it.
That's amazing. Ilana, in your mind, how could the newly founded Emil and Jenny Fish Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center at YU, how could it be a resource and of help to a center like yours?
I'm so excited about the work that you are doing and what you're starting there. I think it's an incredible opportunity for teachers to go deeper, go further, We need experienced teachers in the field. In Washington State, we need them. I'm sure everywhere in the country needs them. And you guys are providing that without anyone even needing to go to YU. We can join in online and be part of the program, I understand.
That's the vision.
So,
exactly.
Yeah, so I think that's amazing. And we need those educators to help teach other educators, to help inform our Holocaust Center and work with us, and to reach out to the students.
Ilana, thank you for saying that. I have to applaud your work and salute you for the work that you do. I know how much the work of a director of education and any Holocaust education professional on the ground is when you have to interact with volunteers, with teachers, with students, with board members. You are doing such an important and inspiring work. So thank you so much for joining me for this fascinating conversation. Just to rehash the series, we were talking about core issues that relate to Holocaust education. We talked about, with Dan, we talked about the main challenges. We spoke to Paul about, that was a couple of days ago, about the key themes that students need to know. We talked to Kelly Zaney about the mandate. We spoke to you about artifacts. And on Tuesday, July 21st at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we will be speaking to another colleague of ours, to Ursula Szczepinska. She is the Director of Education and Research at the Florida Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. She's going to speak to us about primary sources, the use of primary sources. Who knows if we will ever get together again? That's in quotation marks. The significance of using primary sources in teaching Holocaust history. So, Ilana Cohn-Kennedy, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us for this fascinating conversation, for bringing all the objects and items that you showed us, for teaching us about the artifact trunk, which I was never aware of. I was only aware of the material trunk with the books and the DVDs. And if we speak about prehistory VHS, video cassettes, of course, I learned a lot from you, and so did our viewers. If you don't mind staying offline later to see some of the questions, and hopefully you will continue to follow us with Holocaust education in times of uncertainty. Ilana, thank you, and have a great rest of your afternoon. I would say 2 o'clock Pacific time, right? Or
yes. Oh, 12, it's 12:30 Pacific time.
My goodness. Okay.
I still have the whole day ahead of me.
We're in many different time zones. Thank you. Take care. And I'll be with you next week on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Bye-bye.